He had been a fixture at the palace for as long as anyone could remember, not a fixture of importance, like the diplomats or the dignitaries, but a fixture of the background, like the marble columns or the polished brass railings. His name was John, and he was a royal guard. To the other soldiers who rotated through the prestigious post, he was an object of quiet and sometimes not so quiet ridicule. He was older, his face etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind, not the smooth skin of the academy graduates. His uniform, while immaculate, seemed to hang on a frame that was lean to the point of gauntness. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was often mistaken for lethargy. The younger guards, full of the swagger of youth and the pride of their new positions, would often gather in the mess hall and mimic his steady and almost glacial pace. They called him Granddad, or the Statue, because he could stand perfectly still for his entire shift, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, never fidgeting, never scratching an itch, never once breaking the stoic image of the guard. They saw it as a lack of passion, a robotic compliance. They didn't understand that for some men, stillness was not an absence of action, but a concentration of it. His most vocal critic was a young corporal named Davies. Davies was everything John was not: brash, handsome, and deeply ambitious. He was a star on the regiment's shooting range, consistently topping the leaderboards with a flashy, confident style. He saw John's quiet presence as an affront to the very idea of a soldier. One afternoon, as part of a mandatory cross-training exercise, the entire palace guard detail was ordered to the firing range for a refresher course. It was a chance for the men to blow off steam, show off, and reinforce the pecking order. The range master, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Miller, ran them through the standard drills. Targets popped up at various distances, and the guards took their turns, the air cracking with gunfire. Davies was, as expected, impressive. He was fast, accurate, and his reloads were a blur of efficient motion. He received congratulatory slaps on the back and appreciative nods from the other men. He soaked it up like a sponge. Then it was John's turn. He walked to the firing point with the same unhurried gait he used on the palace forecourt. He picked up the standard-issue rifle, a weapon he hadn't fired in years, and examined it with a quiet and almost reverent attention. He checked the action, the sights, the balance, movements that to the onlookers looked like the fumbling of someone who didn't know what he was doing. "Come on, Granddad! It's not a museum piece, just shoot it!" Davies called out, earning a ripple of laughter from the other guards. John ignored him. He loaded the magazine, a process that was slow and deliberate. He then settled into a prone position, but it wasn't the textbook position they'd all been taught. He seemed to melt into the ground, his body becoming one with the earth. He took a breath, let half of it out, and then nothing. He was utterly still. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. The other guards shifted impatiently. "He's fallen asleep," someone joked. Then the targets started. Not the single predictable pop-ups from the drill, but a complex sequence. 3 targets, far down range, appeared almost simultaneously. In the space of a single extended breath, 3 shots rang out. They were so close together they sounded like a short, sharp burst of automatic fire, but John was firing a semi-automatic. Before anyone could process the sound, all 3 targets, cardboard silhouettes of hostile forces, snapped backward and vanished, each one hit with a perfect center mass shot. A stunned silence fell over the range. Davies's smirk froze on his face. Sergeant Miller, who had been leaning against a post, slowly straightened up, his eyes narrowed. John, his expression unchanged, smoothly ejected the magazine, cleared the weapon, and placed it back on the table. He stood up, brushing a speck of dust from his trousers, and walked back to his place in line as if he'd just completed a task as mundane as signing a logbook. The silence was broken by the range master. "Davies," Miller said, his voice low and devoid of its usual gruffness. "Get down there and change those targets. Bring them back." Davies, his face pale, jogged down the range. He returned a few minutes later, carrying the 3 perforated silhouettes. He held them up without a word. Each one had a single hole, perfectly placed where the heart would be. The grouping was so tight you could have covered all 3 with a dinner plate. From over 800 meters. With an unfamiliar, standard-issue rifle. In a matter of seconds. Sergeant Miller walked over to John. The other guards watched, expecting a reprimand for breaking from the drill, or perhaps an inquiry into how a palace guard could possibly shoot like that. Miller just stood in front of the older man for a moment. He didn't offer a handshake or a word of praise. He simply gave a short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, a recognition between 2 men who understood what they had just witnessed. John returned the nod, just as briefly. The message was clear. "I see you." The rest of the guards, including a humiliated Davies, were left in a cloud of confusion, their entire perception of the quiet man shattered into 1,000 pieces. The incident on the firing range rippled through the palace guard detail like a stone thrown into a still pond. For the first few days, it was all anyone could talk about. The 3 perfect shots became a legend, growing more impossible with each retelling. Corporal Davies, at once the center of attention, found himself isolated. The other guards, who had so readily joined in his mockery, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and judgment. He had been publicly and profoundly wrong, but the questions lingered, unanswered and unsettling. Who was this man? How did a middle-aged palace guard, seemingly at the end of his career, possess a level of marksmanship that belonged in the realm of fantasy? The official records, when anyone was bold enough to sneak a peek, were frustratingly bare. They stated his name, his date of joining, his unremarkable postings. It was a ghost of a file, a story with all its chapters ripped out. The whispers grew louder, but they were whispers of a different kind now. They were laced with awe and a touch of fear. Men who had casually clapped him on the shoulder now gave him a wide berth. They reevaluated every slow movement, every quiet moment, searching for clues they had been too blind to see. They began to notice things they hadn't before. The way his eyes would unconsciously scan a crowded room, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way he could walk across a gravel path without making a sound. The unsettling calm that radiated from him. A calm that now felt less like passivity and more like the dormant power of a coiled spring. The change was most pronounced in Davies. His bravado was gone, replaced by a gnawing curiosity and a deep, personal shame. He couldn't get the image out of his head. The older man, lying prone, utterly still. And then the 3 shots, faster than thought. He started watching John from a distance. Not with ridicule, but with a desperate need to understand. He saw the way John interacted with the tourists, not with the robotic indifference of a guard, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible vigilance. He saw the way his gaze would linger just a second too long on a person who seemed out of place, or on a vehicle that was parked awkwardly. One evening, Davies found himself on a late-night duty roster with John, patrolling the outer perimeter of the palace grounds. The silence between them was heavy, a physical presence. They walked for 20 minutes without a word, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the distant hum of the city. Finally, Davies couldn't contain it any longer. "The shot's on the range," he blurted out, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. "How?" John didn't break his stride, and he continued to scan the darkness ahead. For a long moment, Davies thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice as calm and steady as the man himself, John spoke. "It's not about the shooting, son. It's about the waiting." He said nothing more for another 100 yards. Davies walked beside him, the words hanging in the air. He was about to ask another question when John stopped. He held up a hand, a silent, absolute command for silence. Davies froze. John tilted his head, listening. Davies heard nothing but the wind in the trees. John, however, seemed to be hearing a different frequency altogether. Then, in the distance, a twig snapped. It was a faint sound, almost lost in the night, but John had caught it. He moved then, not with his usual slowness, but with a fluid, silent grace that was startling. And he melted into the shadows of a large oak tree, becoming one with it. He gestured for Davies to stay put. Minutes passed, an eternity of silence. Davies's heart hammered against his ribs. Finally, a figure emerged from the tree line on the other side of the perimeter fence. It was a man, fumbling with a pair of bolt cutters. Before he could even begin to cut the chain link, two things happened simultaneously. A security light, triggered by a motion sensor Davies didn't even know existed, flooded the area with brilliant white light, and a calm, clear voice cut through the night. That would be a very bad idea. It was John. He was no longer in the shadows. He was standing 50 feet from the intruder in the open, completely exposed. The intruder, a young man who looked more scared than dangerous, dropped the bolt cutters and threw his hands up, his face a mask of terror. He had been caught, not by a patrol, but by a ghost who had appeared from nowhere. The police were called and the man was taken away. He turned out to be a lost, drunk tourist, but the point had been made. In the aftermath, as the adrenaline subsided, Davies looked at John. The older man was calm, his breathing even, as if he'd just completed a minor chore. "The waiting," John said, his eyes still on the departing police car. "And knowing when to stop." That night, Davies began to grasp a fragment of the truth. This wasn't just a skill, it was a state of being, and the quiet man he had mocked was a master of it. The weeks following the perimeter incident brought a strange, new equilibrium to the palace guard detail. The ridicule had stopped entirely, replaced by a respectful distance. But the mystery of John only deepened. He remained the same quiet, unassuming man, performing his duties with his characteristic, unnerving stillness. He never spoke of the shooting, never acknowledged the change in how he was treated. He was a locked room, and the key was nowhere to be found. For Davies, the encounter had been transformative. His arrogance had been replaced by a humbling realization of his own ignorance. He began to see the world differently, trying to see it through John's eyes. He noticed the small details, the anomalies in the everyday. He started to understand that true security wasn't about flashy drills and loud confidence, but about patience, observation, and an almost preternatural awareness. He also started his own quiet investigation. He didn't pry or ask direct questions, but he listened. He listened to the old-timers in the regiment, the ones who had been around for decades. He listened to the gossip in the pubs near the barracks, the tales of soldiers who had done things that could never be spoken of in public. He heard fragments, whispers of a unit so secret its very existence was a rumor, the SAS. He heard stories of operations in deserts and jungles, of men who could disappear into a landscape and reappear only to deliver death with a single, impossible shot. He heard of long-range kills that defied the laws of physics, of patient observers who would wait for days in a hide no bigger than a grave for a single moment of certainty. The profile, he realized with a growing sense of awe, fit John perfectly. The age, the stillness, the preternatural calm under pressure, the way he could seemingly teleport from one shadow to another. The 3 shots on the range, which had seemed like a miracle, were probably, for a man like that, just a routine day at the office. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A sleek, black car with diplomatic plates pulled up to a secure gate of the palace. A high-ranking official from a foreign government, a man known to be a high-value target for numerous terrorist organizations, was arriving for a confidential meeting. The security was immense, but the palace guards were only a small part of it. The real security was invisible. As the official was escorted from his car to a waiting internal vehicle, Davies was on a nearby post. He saw John, standing at his usual position near a colonnade, as still as ever. But then, something happened. And the official, a tall, distinguished man in a dark coat, paused for a moment to look up at the sky. As he did, his eyes swept across the courtyard and met John's for a fraction of a second. It was an almost imperceptible pause, a flicker of recognition. Then the official gave the smallest of nods, a gesture so subtle it was barely a movement of his head. John, in return, gave no outward sign of recognition, but Davies, watching closely, saw it. He saw the almost microscopic relaxation in John's shoulders, a fraction of an inch. It was the body language of 2 people who knew each other, who shared a bond that needed no words. It was the greeting between a protector and the protected. But it wasn't the dynamic of a palace guard and a visiting diplomat. It was something else. It was the look between 2 men who had been in the same places, who had seen the same things. It was the look of one operator acknowledging another. The realization hit Davies like a physical blow. John wasn't just a former soldier, he was still operational. His posting at the palace, this quiet, menial job, was a cover. It was the perfect camouflage. Who would ever look twice at the aging, slow-moving guard? He was invisible, a piece of furniture. And from that position of utter obscurity, he could watch. He could monitor the comings and goings of everyone who passed through the palace gates. He was a ghost in the machine, a last line of defense so deeply buried that no one even knew he was there. The diplomat's car drove away, and John resumed his statue-like stillness. The moment was over. But for Davies, the world had shifted on its axis. He wasn't looking at a slow old guard anymore. And he was looking at a silent sentinel, a guardian angel with a rifle, a man whose entire life was a classified document. The respect he felt morphed into something deeper, a profound reverence for the weight this man carried, the secrets he held, the lives he had almost certainly saved. John wasn't just the most lethal sniper the SAS had ever produced. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a ghost. And Davies was one of the few people ever permitted to see him. Years have passed since that rainy afternoon. Corporal Davies, now a seasoned sergeant major with lines of his own etched onto his face, walked through the quiet corridors of a military retirement home. He was there on a routine visit, a duty he performed with a quiet dignity that had become his hallmark. The brash young man was long gone, replaced by a thoughtful leader who taught his own soldiers the power of patience and the importance of the unseen. He paused outside a door at the end of a sunlit hallway. On it was a simple nameplate, J. Smith. He knocked softly and entered. The room was sparse, almost monastic. A bed, a chair, a small table with a single book on it. And in the chair, looking out the window at the gardens, sat John. He was older now, his frame even more gaunt, his hair white. But his eyes, when they turned to meet Davies, were the same. Clear, calm, and utterly present. He showed no surprise at seeing Davies. He simply nodded, the same short, sharp nod Sergeant Miller had given him all those years ago. Davies sat in the other chair, and for a long time, they just sat in silence, watching the birds on the lawn. It was a comfortable silence, and the kind that exists between people who have no need for small talk. Finally, Davies spoke. "I never thanked you." John's eyes didn't leave the window. "For what?" "For teaching me how to wait. For showing me that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. For being the most terrifyingly impressive man I have ever met. And for doing it all while the rest of us just saw a statue." A faint smile, the first Davies had ever seen on his face, touched the corner of John's mouth. "I was just doing my job, son." "I know," Davies said. "That's what made it so impressive." They fell back into silence. Davies looked around the room. It was bare of any medals, any photographs, any evidence of an extraordinary life. There were no plaques commemorating far-off battles, no yellowed newspaper clippings, no letters of commendation. It was the room of a man who had spent his life in the shadows and had chosen to remain there, even in the twilight. The only personal item was the book on the table. Davies picked it up. It was an old, worn copy of a classic text on military strategy, The Book of Five Rings, by Miyamoto Musashi. He opened it, and on the inside cover, in a faded, elegant hand, was an inscription. It wasn't a name or a date. It was a single line. "Perceive that which cannot be seen." Davies understood. It was the creed of the ghost. It was the lesson John had lived and taught without ever saying a word. He placed the book back on the table. He looked at the old man in the chair, this living legend who had chosen to be a footnote in his own story. The world would never know his name. There would be no parades, no statues erected in his honor. Then his battlefield was the quiet corners, the overlooked details, the long, patient waits. His victories were secrets, his heroism an invisible shield. As Davies stood up to leave, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the lesson in soldiering, but for the lesson in life. He had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a chance to see true greatness, which, he now understood, was not about seeking the light, but about being content in the darkness, protecting the light for others. He reached the door and turned back. John was still looking out the window, a solitary figure against the light. He was at peace. He had done his duty. "Goodbye, John," Davies said softly. He didn't expect a response, and for a moment, he didn't get one. But just as his hand touched the doorknob, John's quiet. A steady voice filled the room one last time. "The palace looks quiet today," he said, his eyes still on the gardens. "That's good. A quiet day is a good day." Davies smiled. The sentinel was still on watch even here. He closed the door softly behind him, leaving the ghost to his silence, and the memory of 3 perfect shots echoing in the quiet halls of history.